Imagine a king so wealthy that when he simply passes through a city, the economy collapses. Not with war, not with conquest, but with generosity. In the early 1300s, across the blazing sands of the Sahara, a caravan appears on the horizon, tens of thousands strong. Camels groan under the weight of gold. Soldiers march in silence. Slaves carry staffs plated in pure metal. At the center of it all rides one man, Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali, ruler of a land that controls much of the world as a gold source. When he reaches Cairo on his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he doesn't just spend gold, he floods the city with it. Markets swell. Prices twist. The value of gold drops 4 years after he leaves, as if his wealth was a natural disaster, and the world can't believe what it's seeing. European mapmakers later paint him holding a golden orb on the Catalan Atlas, labeling him the richest ruler on earth. Not a myth, not a rumor. A warning to the world. There is a kingdom of gold beyond the desert. But here's the real mystery. How did a man from West Africa, from an empire many outside Africa barely knew existed, become history's richest human being? What kind of kingdom produces wealth so vast that even today we can't calculate it? And what happens to an empire when its king becomes too rich for the world to handle? This is the story of Mansa Musa. If you like videos like this, smash the like and comment yes, and tell me which famous person should be next. Drop their name below. A slow aerial sweep over the Niger River. Sunlight catches the water like molten bronze. In the distance, bustling markets, clay cities, caravans stretching toward the desert. Before the world ever knew his name, before Cairo trembled under his gold, Mansa Musa was simply a prince in a dynasty built on sand, steel, and trade. Musa was born into the Keita royal family, heirs of Sundiata Keita, the legendary founder of the Mali Empire. This wasn't a small kingdom. Mali was a superpower of West Africa, positioned on the arteries of trans-Saharan trade. Gold flowed north. Salt flowed south. Cities like Timbuktu and Gao grew rich as crossroads of learning and commerce. To be born royal in Mali meant something different than in Europe. In Europe, kings hoarded wealth behind castle walls. In Mali, wealth moved, carried on, caravans, measured in trade routes, and guarded by armies of the desert. Musa grew up watching the empire breathe like a living thing, a machine of diplomacy, conquest, and gold. History docen tejibe us Musa's exact birth date. It doesn't even give us many stories of his childhood. And that silence is telling, because Musa wasn't expected to be king. He was a branch of the family tree, close to power, but not sitting on top of it. Still, he was educated in the necessities of rule, the politics of rival clans, the discipline of court, and the rising influence of Islam in Mali's elite. Islam had been present in West Africa for centuries, but during Musa's era it was becoming a language of legitimacy, a passport into the wider intellectual world of North Africa and the Middle East. Musa absorbed that world, early and then something extraordinary happened. The reigning Mansa, most commonly identified in Arabic sources as Muhammad ibn Ku, Abu Bakr, became obsessed with what lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean. According to Musa's own later account, the king launched massive expeditions westward. First, hundreds of ships, then thousands. And finally, the Mansa went himself. He never came back. Some historians accept that a voyage may have happened. Others think the story could be political cover for a palace takeover. Either way, what matters is the result. The throne was suddenly empty, and Musa was the deputy left holding the empire together. Imagine the moment. a young prince, not first in line, standing before an empire that expects stability, strength, and certainty, while its king has vanished into the sea. When it became clear the old Mansa would never return, Musa was crowned Mansa of Mali around 1312, the date most widely accepted today. But coronation is the easy part. The real question was, could this prince hold the center of a giant empire? Because Mali was rich, and rich empires attract storms, Musa took the throne young. Possibly in his 20s, almost immediately, he focused on two things. One, securing the empire's borders. Mali's wealth depended on controlling trade corridors and gold regions. Musa's early reign involved military campaigns and expansion to keep rival powers and rebellious provinces in check, to preparing for something bigger than war, a pilgrimage. Not a simple journey, but a statement to the world that Mali wasn't a rumor. It was reality. And Musa was about to introduce that reality, with so much gold that history would never forget. So before he became the richest man anyone had ever seen, Mansa Musa was a prince who inherited an empire after a king disappeared into the ocean, a ruler who had to prove himself in silence, before announcing himself in gold, and next he would step beyond the desert and walk into legend. In the courts of Mali, wealth was not counted the way other kingdoms counted it. Gold wasn't rare. It wasn't sacred. It was everywhere, pulled from the earth, in rivers of dust and stone, then pushed north along the desert veins of trade. But Mansa Musa wasn't satisfied being a rich king in a rich empire. He wanted something bigger than rule, bigger than conquest. He wanted recognition, because beyond the Sahara, many still saw West Africa as a blank space on the map, Mysterioland, Rumorland. Maybe not. Musa understood power in a way that few rulers did. Power isn't only what you have, it's what the world believes you have. So he chose the one act that could turn Mali into a name the world would never forget. He would go on Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, not quietly, not modestly. He would go in a way that forced history to look at him. Preparations began like a slow drum beat, turning into thunder. Messengers rode out across the empire. Gold was gathered, provisions stockpiled, routes secured, and then the caravan assembled. It wasn't a travel party. It was a moving civilization. Arabic chroniclers later described a procession of tens of thousands, soldiers, officials, family members, servants, enslaved people, all flowing behind their emperor like a golden tide across the desert. Camels carried bars of gold. Some accounts say hundreds of camels, each loaded with heavy amounts of pure metal. Even the walking staffs of attendants were gold. Imagine the sight. A sunlit sea of boaties moving through sand. Armor flashing, silk banners snapping in hot wind. Dust rising behind them like smoke from a giant invisible fire. Where this caravan passed, villages woke up in panic. Not fear of attack, but fear of something else. An emperor so rich that reality bends around him. And Musa wasn't doing this only for spectacle. He was deeply Muslim, and Mali's royal court had long been tied to Islam. The Hajj was a religious duty, but for a ruler, it was also a political one. Every step toward Mecca was also a step toward the wider world. In Musa's mind, this journey would do three things at once. It would honor his faith, it would announce Mali's legitimacy, and it would place his empire into the global story of power. By 1324, the caravan crossed into North Africa. Word ran ahead of it like wildfire. In every market and palace along the route, people whispered the same thing. A king is coming from the south, a king made of gold. They didn't believe it at first. How could they? Most rulers in that era struggled to keep armies fed, to keep kingdoms from falling apart, to scrape enough treasure to fund a war. And now they were hearing about a man who treated gold like sand. So when Mansa Musa finally approached Cairo, the jewel of the Islamic world, the city braced itself to witness something either legendary or impossible. They had no idea which one it would be, because Cairo was about to meet a king whose generosity would explode across the city like a storm. Not a storm of fire, a storm of gold. And after he left, nothing in Cairo or in the world's imagination would ever be the same. Cairo in 1324 was not just a city. It was the beating heart of the Islamic world, a capital of scholars, merchants, diplomats, and kings, a place where caravans arrived every day carrying goods from 3 continents, and where wealth still had limits. Then word hit the streets. A ruler from West Africa was approaching, not with an army to conquer, but with a fortune so huge people didn't have a language for it. By the time Mansa Musa entered Cairo, the city was already leaning forward like a crowd about to witness a comet. Arabic historian Al-Mari, writing from interviews with Cairene society, describes a scene of pure disbelief. The citizens of Cairo talking for years afterward about the prodigal spending of the Malian king and his entourage. They watched the procession roll in. Soldiers in disciplined silence, officials in embroidered cloth, servants moving like a river behind their emperor, and gold everywhere. Not hidden, not guarded like a sacred secret, but displayed like sunlight. Musa didn't arrive acting like a guest. He arrived like a force of nature. What shocked Cairo most wasn't the size of his caravan. It was what he did next. He began giving gold away the way other kings gave away smiles. 2 governors, 2 merchants, 2 scholars. To the poor lining the streets. Al-Omari's account says Musa's generosity was so extreme that it became the main story in every market and every court he touched. Gold coins poured into hands that had never imagined holding them. Gold dust spilled into transactions like seasoning. Cairo's economy, built on careful flow and balance, suddenly found itself hit by a flood. And when that much gold enters a market that fast, gold stops behaving like treasure. It starts behaving like water. The value of gold dropped. Sources tied to the Cairo Witnesses report that gold's price fell after Musa's arrival and stayed low for years. A phenomenon later writers traced directly to his spending spree. Some modern historians debate how catastrophic the shock was, noting gold prices can fluctuate, but even the skeptical scholars agree on the core truth. Mansa Musa's generosity was real, vast, and economically disruptive. Think about what that means. A single traveler passing through a global capital, accidentally rewriting its economy. History has very few moments like that, and the people of Cairo had never seen a king like this, because Musa didn't just give gold. He spent it with calm certainty, like a man who couldn't imagine running out. It was the kind of confidence that makes rumors grow teeth. By the time he left Cairo, stories were already mutating. There is a king in Mali who commands rivers of gold. There is a land beyond the desert where wealth is endless. The Middle East was stunned. North Africa was electrified. And Europe, half blind to Africa at the time, heard the whispers and turned them into obsession. Musa wasn't trying to conquer Cairo, but he conquered imagination. When Mansa Musa rode out of Cairo toward Mecca, the city stared after him like someone waking from a dream. Their markets were changed. Their legends were born. And the world had just learned something new. That the center of wealth on earth didn't sit in Europe, or Arabia, or China. It sat in Mali. And next, on the road to Mecca, Mansa Musa would meet rulers, scholars, and architects who would transform his empire forever, turning Mali from a kingdom of gold into a kingdom of knowledge. When Mansa Musa finally reached Mecca, he wasn't arriving as a stranger, By then, the road had already carried his legend ahead of him. Cairo had felt the weight of his gold. The desert had watched his empire march. And now, the holiest city in Islam was about to meet a king whose name the world was learning to pronounce with awe. In Mecca, Musa performed the Hajj like any devoted Muslim ruler would, but his presence turned heads everywhere he went. Not because he demanded attention, but because attention couldn't look away. Scholars, judges, merchants, and rulers from across the Islamic world encountered him. They spoke with him, they measured him, and many of them left with the same realization. Mali was not a distant fringe of civilization, it was a pillar of it. But Musa didn't come to Mecca only to be seen. He came to collect something more valuable than gold: knowledge, craft, prestige. On the return journey, he recruited and brought back scholars, poets, and architects from the heartlands of Islam. Men who carried books instead of swords, blueprints instead of spears. One of the most famous names linked to this return is the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq, often credited in sources with helping design major buildings in Mali, including the Great Mosque of Timbuktu. This is the part many people miss about Mansa Musa. He wasn't trying to build a legend of personal luxury. He was trying to build a civilization that would outlive him. So when he crossed back into Mali, the gold caravan that had stunned Cairo came home. But it came home changed, because Musa didn't return as a king who had simply traveled. He returned as a king who had plugged Mali directly into the world's intellectual bloodstream. Almost immediately, he began reshaping his empire. Mosques rose in city after city. Public buildings expanded. And Timbuktu, once a wealthy trading town, began its transformation into something far rarer. A center of learning so respected that students would travel across the Sahara to sit in its libraries and classrooms. The University of Sankar and other institutions in Timbuktu grew into a major scholarly hub of the 14th century Islamic world. Law, mathematics, astronomy, theology, all studied under Mali's roof of gold and clay. And suddenly, Mali wasn't just the empire of wealth. It was becoming an empire of ideas. This is what made Musa different from so many rulers in history. Some kings spend fortunes on palaces. Some spend on wars. Some spent on their own immortality. Musa spent on a future, and it worked. News of his pilgrimage and his empire spread so far that European cartographers later placed him on the Catalan Atlas of 1375, seated on a throne, holding a golden orb, labeled the richest ruler of the known world, a West African emperor drawn into Europe's imagination as a symbol of ultimate wealth. Mali was no longer invisible. Mali was mythic, but every golden age carries a shadow. The more Mali rose in glory, the more eyes it attracted. Trade routes sparked envy. Cities grew fat with treasure, and the question began to form beyond the desert. If Mali is this rich, who will try to take it? Next, we follow the peak of Mansa Musa's reign. The empire at its greatest height, and the quiet tensions that would one day test everything he built. By the time Mansa Musa settled back into his throne, Mali was no longer just a great empire. It was the empire. From deep in the forests of West Africa to the edge of the Sahara, Mali stretched across key cities and trade arteries. A realm where caravans moved like blood through veins, carrying gold, salt, ivory, and knowledge. And at the center of this machine sat Musa, deliberate and almost impossible to rival. Not because he screamed power, but because he quietly controlled the world's most desired resource, gold. In Musa's reign, Mali's goldfields, especially in regions like Bambouk and Bur, fed an international market. North African merchants depended on Mali. Middle Eastern traders depended on Mali. Even Europe, still half ignorant of Africa's depth, felt Mali's wealth through the gold that reached its hands. Musa didn't just inherit a fortune. He mastered the system that produced it, and within the empire, something extraordinary was happening. Timbuktu was blooming, not as a myth, as a living city of scholarship. The mosques and schools Musa sponsored became magnets. Books arrived from Cairo, Fez, and Andalusia. Students arrived with them. Judges, theologians, mathematicians, poets, the kind of minds that turn a wealthy state into a lasting civilization. In dusty courtyards, arguments about law and faith echoed all day. In candlelit rooms, scribes copied manuscripts into the night. It was a golden age that didn't glitter only in metal, but in thought. Musa had pulled Mali into the global intellectual map. And for a moment, it worked perfectly. But the higher an empire rises, the harder gravity pulls. Mali's greatness depended on balance, keeping distant provinces loyal, keeping trade routes secure, keeping rivals intimidated, and keeping wealth flowing without tearing the empire apart. That's the hidden danger of extreme wealth. It attracts not only admiration, but appetite. Beyond Mali's borders, rival powers watched the golden roads and imagined them as theirs. Inside Mali, local governors gained influence, and the empire was so vast that even a strong king had to rely on people he couldn't always see or fully control. Musa held it together through charisma, authority, and careful rule. But no emperor lives forever. And here's the quiet question that began to haunt Mali's future. What happens when a king like Musa is gone? For now, though Mali was at its height, the cities were rich, the scholars were many, the trade was unstoppable, and the legend of Mansa Musa grew with every caravan that crossed the desert. This was the peak. The moment Mali looked invincible. But history doesn't stay at peaks. It moves, and somewhere ahead, waiting in the long shadow of Musa's greatness, was the test that every empire eventually faces. Succession, because the real downfall of empires rarely begins with enemies outside the walls. It begins the moment the world asks, who comes next? For more than 2 decades, Mali moved to the rhythm of one man. Trade was secure. Cities flourished. Scholars crowded Timbuktu. Gold kept flowing north, like a river that could never run dry. But even empires built on gold are built on something more fragile, a single human life. As the 1330s approached, Mansa Musa was no longer the young prince who had stepped into an empty throne. He was a seasoned ruler, older, heavier with responsibility, and carrying the quiet burden every great king eventually faces. How do you leave an empire when your shadow is larger than the sun? History doesn't preserve many intimate details of Musa's final years. There's no dramatic death scene recorded by witnesses, no final speech etched into stone. What we do know is the simplest, hardest fact. Around 1337, Mansa Musa died. And the day he died, Mali didn't just lose a king. It lost the person holding the whole dream together. The throne passed to his son Magan Ion. Paper succession looks clean. Farther Toson Empire continues, but empires don't live on paper. They live in loyalty, fear, trust, and the unseen tensions that only a strong ruler can keep quiet. Magan had been left in charge during Musa's pilgrimage years earlier, but ruling after Musa was a different beast. He inherited a territory at its greatest reach, and a legend so overwhelming that any normal ruler would look small beside it. The world had seen Musa. It had felt him. And now it was watching to see if Mali's miracle was a one-man era or an unstoppable civilization. Magan's reign was short, only a few years, and sources paint it as weaker, less steady. After him, power shifted to Musa's brother Magan's uncle, a sign that succession was already wobbling under the weight of dynasty politics. This is how decline often begins. Not with invasion, not wheat fire, but with uncertainty at the center. Local governors gain confidence. Border regions test limits. Rivals sniff opportunity. And the trade machine that once ran smoothly starts to creak. Mali was still rich, still respected, still vast, but the empire had started living off the momentum of a man who was no longer alive. And yet, Musa's legacy refused to die with him. Caravans kept repeating his story in every market from Gao to Cairo. Scholars kept teaching in Timbuktu. Under institutions, his wealth had expanded, and in Europe mapmakers still drew him seated on a throne, gripping a golden orb, the forever symbol of a kingdom that once rewrote reality with wealth. Even when Mali began to fade centuries later, the myth of Musa never did. Because he wasn't remembered only as a king of gold, he was remembered as proof that an African empire once stood at the center of the world, rich enough to shake economies, powerful enough to command deserts, and wise enough to turn treasure into learning. But history is merciless. The Golden Age cannot last forever. After Musa, Mali would face internal strain, rising rivals, and the slow bleeding of its trade dominance, until the empire that once lit the world with gold became a memory for others to chase. Next, we follow that long, dramatic decline, and how the world that once feared Mali's wealth eventually moved in to claim what it could. After Mansa Musa, Mali was still huge, still rich, still feared. But an empire isn't a pile of gold. It's a heartbeat. And Mali's heartbeat had been one man. When he was gone, the empire kept moving for a while, on momentum alone. His son Magan I ruled briefly. Then power shifted to Musa's brothers. That alone tells you what was happening inside the palace. Succession was no longer smooth, and the center was beginning to wobble. At first, it didn't look like collapse. It looked like small cracks. Short reigns, court rivalries, distant governors growing to powerful border provinces testing loyalty. But Mali was a trade empire. It lived on the control of roads, and roads can be taken. In the late 1300s and early 1400s, enemies weren't crashing through Mali's gates in one dramatic battle. They were nibbling at its edges. From the south and east, mossy raids cut into Mali's influence and exposed how hard it was to protect such a vast realm without a giant like Musa at the center. From the desert, Tuareg forces pressed down from the Sahel, and then came the moment that felt like a thunderclap across West Africa. Around 1433 to 1434, Timbuktu, jewel of scholarship and trade, slipped out of Mali's control and fell to the Tuareg. Think about what that meant. Timbuktu wasn't just a city. It was Mali's symbol, its library of reputation, its crown of learning. And now that crown was gone. Once an empire starts losing its anchors, the sea gets rough fast. As Mali weakened in the north, another power was rising along the Niger River. You could almost feel history shifting its weight. Songhai first took Niamey around 1465, one of Mali's old possessions. Then, in 1468, under the Iron-willed ruler, Sunni Ali, Songhai seized Timbuktu from the Tuareg. So, within a single generation, Mali lost the city that had once broadcast its greatness to the world. Not to one enemy, but two, one after the other. It wasn't a fall off a cliff. It was bleeding. Mali tried to respond. There were diplomatic moves, even contact with Portuguese envoys in the late 1400s, a desperate attempt to find allies and new routes as old ones slipped away. But the engine of Mali's dominance control of trans-Saharan trade was now shared, contested, and increasingly diverted. The empire that once held the world's gold tap was losing its grip on the handle. By the 1500s, Mali was no longer the center of West African power. It still existed, still proud, still dangerous in places. But the age of Mali had passed, and then, toward the end of the 1500s, the last heavy blows landed. After Songhai itself was smashed by Morocco in 1591, Mali tried to reclaim its old influence. But the attempt failed. By about 1599 to 1610, Mali's central authority fractured beyond repair. Rival heirs fought over what remained, and the empire dissolved into smaller states. The Empire of Gold ended not with a single funeral, but with the quiet sound of a giant finally running out of blood. And yet, here's the part history can't erase. Even after Mali fell, Timbuktu's manuscripts survived. Its scholars kept teaching, its mosques kept standing. The cultural fire Musa had fed with gold didn't go out when the empire did. Because Mansa Musa's legacy was never just the richest man. It was this. He proved that an African empire could be so wealthy it shook world economies, so powerful it rewrote maps, and so visionary it turned gold into knowledge. That's why, centuries later, we still say his name, not as a myth. As a reminder, there was once a king whose wealth was unimaginable, and whose empire lit the world from the heart of Africa. So when people ask, who was the richest man in history? The answer isn't a modern billionaire. It isn't an emperor of Rome. It's a king who ruled from the heart of West Africa, Mansa Musa, a man whose pilgrimage in 1324 to 1325 turned heads across the Islamic world, and whose spending in Cairo was so vast that chroniclers said it pushed gold's value down for years. But the real story was never just the gold, because Musa didn't come home and bury his wealth in a palace. He poured it into cities, into mosques, into schools, into scholars. He helped spark the rise of Timbuktu as a global symbol of learning, and Mali's name became so powerful that even European mapmakers drew him on the Catalan Atlas 1375, seated on a golden throne holding an orb, a visual announcement to the world that unimaginable wealth lived in Mali. And yet, like every empire tied to one giant soul, Mali struggled once that soul was gone. Musa died around 1337, and within a generation's succession, tension grew, rulers changed quickly, and the empire began to loosen at the edges. Over the next century, the wealth that had made Mali legendary also made it a target. The Tuareg took Timbuktu in the 1430s, and later, the rising Songhai under Sunni Ali seized it again in 1468, proof that Mali's golden grip was slipping. By the late 1500s, Mali fractured into smaller states. The Empire of Gold faded, but the story didn't. Because even after the throne fell silent, Musa's legacy stayed loud. He proved something history often tries to hide, that Africa wasn't waiting to be discovered. It was already shaping the world's economy, scholarship, and imagination. So when you picture Mansa Musa, don't only picture gold. Picture a king who walked into global history and forced the world to redraw its map of power. And maybe the most haunting part of all is this. Somewhere beneath the dunes, beneath the Niger's bend, beneath the quiet libraries of Timbuktu, the echoes of that golden age are still there, whispering that once, not long ago in the scale of history, the world's brightest empire rose from Mali.